Well, now to Gaza. U.S. President Trump is pushing for the next phase of the UN-backed ceasefire plan. He's due to discuss the peace process with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu later this month. Now, one obstacle is the return of the last dead hostage held by Hamas, and many other issues have yet to be resolved.
Conditions in Gaza remain dire more than 2 months after the start of the truce's first phase. The vast majority of the territory's more than 2 million people are still displaced, with shortages of food, water and medical supplies. Aid groups have accused Israel of not upholding its commitment to allow aid enter the Strip without interference. All the while, and despite the ceasefire, there's been no let-up in the bloodshed. Since October 10th, hundreds of Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military, according to local health authorities. The Israeli military says several soldiers have been killed by Hamas militants in that time. The return of the last Israeli hostages' remains is one of the main sticking points for moving into the second phase of the truce. So far, they have not been handed over to Israel by Hamas. Once this takes place, Phase 2 could begin under the peace plan backed by US President Donald Trump. These are the main objectives: Hamas's disarmament, the deployment of an international stabilization force, the formation of a technocratic Palestinian committee to administer Gaza, the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. But serious hurdles remain. When it comes to Hamas's disarmament, a senior Hamas official said the group would be open to freezing their weapons, but not to total disarmament, which is part of Trump's peace plan. No countries have committed to being part of an international stabilization force over safety concerns and the possibility of having to deal with armed factions in Gaza. An agreement over the formation of a technocratic Palestinian committee within Gaza also remains unresolved. And finally, the Israeli military's total withdrawal from Gaza appears to also have been put in doubt too. They've moved to the so-called yellow line from the blue zone inside the Gaza Strip. In time, the Israeli military is supposed to withdraw to a smaller security zone shown here in red. But it's unclear if they will totally withdraw from the territory or remain in a small buffer zone inside Gaza. A complex set of issues that need to be ironed out before Phase 3 can even be contemplated.
Daniel Levy is a former Israeli peace negotiator and the president of the U.S. Middle East Project. That's a not-for-profit policy institute focused on promoting Israeli-Palestinian peace. Welcome, Daniel. It's great to have you on the show. Now, President Donald Trump wants to move quickly into Phase 2 of this UN-endorsed Gaza ceasefire plan. From your perspective, is this urgency constructive?
Absolutely. The situation is extremely urgent. Palestinians are still being killed every day. Perhaps less than a quarter of the aid that was committed to by Israel that would be allowed to enter Gaza. Of course, it should be free access, but Israel was allowed to get away, first of all, with starvation during the more intense period of the genocide. And now it's supposed to at least let a modicum of assistance in. It's preventing that from going in. The conditions we see, we just saw them on your screens. We should see them on the screens more often. It would be good if you had journalists there or insisted on having journalists there. Nonetheless, the conditions are appalling. So the urgency is correct. The way one goes about it, the way the American president goes about it, is, of course, the key question, because thus far, this is a ceasefire in name only, of course, and while one welcomes the release of the Israelis who were held, the release of Palestinians held by Israel, one welcomes that it's in the single figures, not the triple digits, Palestinians being killed every day, and at least the full-on starvation blockade is eased. Those things are not enough, and Trump will have to lean in and insist on the recalcitrant party, which is primarily Israel here, living up to its commitments, which it is not doing.
I want to get to the quality of the ceasefire in a second. Israel, of course, denies it is committing or it has committed acts of genocide in Gaza. I first want to look at one of the major obstacles here on moving on to Phase 2, the return of the last deceased Israeli hostage Ran Gvili. Search efforts are reportedly delayed due to bad weather. If his remains were tragically never to be found, would that leave the process forever stuck in phase one? Would it maybe collapse entirely? What do you think?
Well, I think that the Israelis have a number of excuses for not moving on with the process. That is one of them. I think most people would look at this and say the remarkable thing, after all the devastation and destruction, is that all bar one of those bodies have somehow been returned. Israel, of course, is holding Palestinians whose fate is unknown. It has disappeared a number of Palestinians. So we do not know the fate of many Palestinians Israel is holding. People are pretty indifferent to that. There is apparently no interest in sending in rubble removal equipment to get to dead Palestinian bodies, but it is right to try and get Ran Gvili back. And I hope that his family, it's going to be heartbreaking closure, but I hope his family does get closure on this. But that is not a reason to move forward. When the deal was done, you can find this clip if you like, President Trump actually said, I'm not sure we can get all the bodies back, which I think is a reasonable thing. So no, what we should see is forward movement. What we shouldn't see, and these aren't, Israel denies. Of course, Israel denies it. I don't know why you need always to insert that phrase that Israel denies. Let the Israeli officials do that if they so require. I'm not sure that it's your job to do that. But anyway, Israel should be adhering to the agreement, not killing Palestinians on a daily basis, not preventing at least 75% of the trucks that are supposed to be allowed in access to Gaza, not preventing people from having even temporary shelter in these appalling conditions. So, no, I do not think the fate, tragic as it is, of one unreturned body is going to be the determining factor.
Hundreds of Palestinians and 3 Israeli soldiers have reportedly been killed since the truce began in October. Both sides are accusing each other of violations on a daily basis. You touched on it earlier. Is this really a ceasefire or just war on another level?
It is the latter. I don't want to make light of the improvement in the situation, Nicole, and I think we both acknowledged that it is the case that hostages released, Palestinian prisoners released. The intensity of that starvation blockade is not what it was. It is still criminal and a violation of international law, but it's not at that same level. The killings are still criminal and a violation of international law by Israel every single day. Hundreds of civilians killed since the supposed ceasefire. So it's an improvement, but it is not a ceasefire. The American president tells us that after 3,000 years, there is now peace in the Middle East. I think that can be filed alongside other things that are patently untrue that have been spoken by that president. And I think one of the problems is not just Trump's self-created reality that he lives in and the claims that he has, but that so many other actors are keen to say, nothing to see here, there's a ceasefire, let's put this in the low maintenance file and move on. That applies to many of Israel and America's Western allies, none more criminally negligent than the German government and the visit by Chancellor Merz to Israel, the resumption of military sales, the threats around were Israel to be barred from Eurovision. So Germany has returned to its traditional role of the most active, alongside the US, aider and abettor and complicit actor in violations of international law, criminal behavior, and genocide, despite, by the way, an International Court of Justice ruling in the Nicaragua case, which was not ruled in favor of Nicaragua and against Germany on the provision of arms, but did make the statement in terms of what Germany legally can and cannot do, and Germany is in daily violation of that.
I want to play a short clip from Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. She was speaking about Gaza's future and the conditions she believes must be established before rebuilding.
I think Gaza will be rebuilt and can be rebuilding is not an issue. We have rebuilt European cities who had been torn into pieces. And it can be, I really think that it is to be rebuilt, but without building over the mass graves. There should be justice first. Gaza is a crime scene, so first of all should be preserved so that evidence can be collected to document the crimes that have to lead to accountability, and so that people who have ordered and carried them out and committed them can be held accountable.
Daniel, accountability before reconstruction, is that a realistic prospect given not just the situation on the ground, but also the political environment?
I think it's not just realistic, I think it's absolutely necessary. I wish, in fact, there was that juxtaposition, Nicole. I wish there was that dilemma. The truth is that Israel is not going to allow reconstruction. I think we can confidently say that. Gaza had still not been allowed to be reconstructed from the previous rounds of Israeli destruction in the past decade and a half since Israel imposed its siege on Gaza. So there is not going to be reconstruction. But if one wants there not to be further destruction, if one has any sense that perhaps the resumption of the killing of hundreds on a daily basis, tens of thousands across the last 2 years, if that is not going to return to our screens, and it's bad enough what's still on our screens, but if that's not going to happen, then you absolutely have to begin with accountability. The only reason Israel could get away with what it did, and I believe this is terrible for Israel, by the way. Of course, the Palestinians are the first victims, but no one should be under the illusion that Israelis will have security, that you're somehow a friend of Israel if you encourage the extremism, the genocidal consent in society that has been built. If you do not hold Israel to account, if Israel is treated with impunity, then things will continue to get worse for Palestinians. I would argue more dangerous for Israelis, and that has a knock-on effect for Jews around the world who are supposed, for some reason, to support these criminal actions of the Israeli government and about whom Israel gives not a damn.
Daniel Levy of the U.S. Middle East Project, thank you for your time and for sharing your opinions with us tonight.
Thank you, Nicole.
We recorded that talk earlier. The German government maintains that its policy on arms exports to Israel is conducted strictly within the framework of its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and that export decisions are assessed on a case-by-case basis. German officials argue that they do not knowingly supply weapons for use in violations of international law, and that Israel has a right to self-defense under international law.
Yeah, lots to talk about here. Joining me here in the studio now is our Middle East analyst, Shani Rozanes. Shani, can we even talk about a holding ceasefire? I mean, how many times have there been violations of the current ceasefire?
Well, again and again. Just yesterday, there was an offshoot of Israeli military that had hit at least 11 Palestinians, according to their reports. The IDF is looking into that. In general, Palestinians are reporting about the last 10 weeks of a death toll of about 400 people. So we're talking about 40 a week. That's a lot. That's far less than it was while there was active fighting. That's also undoubtedly. And Israel will claim to its defense that everything that it's done is legal, it's allowed, it's when it's either or mistakenly done, or when it was noticing clear evidence that Hamas was trying to rearm or to organize any activities against Israeli military forces.
Let me ask you about, there's the remains of one Israeli hostage, right, that is yet to be returned to Israel. What's the confidence level in Israel that those remains are ever going to be returned, first of all?
Well, Israeli officials are certain that Hamas knows the whereabouts of the last remaining body. And we need to ask ourselves if that is indeed the case, because Hamas has managed to show quite immense control over the territory and to bring back all the other 254. What would Hamas gain from maybe stalling with the return of the last one? Who has to gain what from this situation? I mean, for Israel, this is part of the ethos, part of the principle that Israel is trying to set. But also, Israel is in no rush to move on to the next phase because, as we just saw, and we will probably discuss in details, there's still many more details up in the air. There's a lot still to clear up, and Israel does not want to rush into anything. And for Hamas, what he's been doing the last 10 weeks is just basically getting stronger and stronger in showing power and control over the territory it does have, about 47% of the Gaza Strip. So they have no impediment, no real need to...
They have no incentive to turn over
to
these
rush too much.
at all.
Correct. And this is exactly where the Americans come into the pictures because they want to see this deadlock solved somehow, and they put a lot of pressure.
Would Israel ever agree to a withdrawal, since we were talking about that in the report, without Hamas disarming?
Well, I think we are now at the point that this is... all the ingredients of what needs to happen are quite clear. There needs to be what we call the international force that comes in, that's a sort of stabilizing force, the ISF. There needs to be Hamas disarmament. There needs to be Israeli withdrawal. These are the main components of the next phase. The question, and this is not a minor question, is what is the order in which things happen? Because Israel keeps saying, we will not withdraw as long as Hamas is not disarming. And Hamas says, we are not going to disarm as long as, there's no guarantees for whatever is happening in Israel. We know for a fact it's going to be taken. More than that, Hamas says, we will disarm or freeze our weapons or store our weapons if we have guarantees for the future of what happens in Gaza. And Israel says, well, first we need to get rid of Hamas and then we can talk about what happens in Gaza. Okay. So this is, again, we're going back to the same circle.
First. Yeah.
Correct.
What's Israel's stance on the deployment of this international stabilization force? I mean,
that's another point of contention between Israel and the Americans because Trump wants to see this going. This week, just a few days ago, there was a meeting in Doha that was hosted by CENTCOM, by the American Central Command Center that also sits in Israel. They were hosting that in Qatar. They invited 70 countries that they want to see taking part in the international stabilization force. Out of these 70, about 45 attended. And from those who attended, only very few are willing to commit to send soldiers into the Gaza Strip. And even then, there's a lot of debate on where will they be deployed. The Americans and the Israelis ideally would like to see them deployed all over the Gaza Strip. Many of them said, if we do send our people, it's when we have guarantees about the future and when we know our people are going to be only operating in the 53% held by Israel, which is where Israel says, well, we don't need your help maintaining what we are already maintaining. And these are some of the key questions that are still to be ironed, and we'll be seeing a lot of it when Trump and Netanyahu are meeting
in Washington.
Correct.
Yeah.
At the end of this month.
Talk about
in Mar-a-Lago.
Mar-a-Lago in Florida. Talk about a lot of loose ends here. Unfortunately, we don't have time to tie them up, but we won't be out of the job anytime soon.
This is not going anywhere,
That's
unfortunately.
Exactly right. Shani, it's always good to have you in the studio. Thank you.
You're welcome, Brent.